Hello and welcome. Very glad you could be with me today. We have a very important and interesting topic. We're going to be talking about sex trafficking. You've been reading a lot about it lately. I have two experts with me. My first guest is Terry Williams. Welcome, Terry.
Thanks, Mary.
Terry is a vice president of strategic initiatives, is her area of expertise with the Women's Foundation of Minnesota. And as I'm sure many of you know, the foundation really has the goal, the really large and wonderful goal of getting rid of sex trafficking.
Right. Yes, that's right.
So she's here to give us all kinds of ideas and tell us about some of their programs.
Right. Yes, delighted to be here.
Our second guest is John Choi. John is the Ramsey County Attorney. He is a national leader in the area of sex trafficking, and you've been pushing on this big topic for a lot of years, haven't you, John?
Yes, and I'm really glad to be on your show to talk about it, Mary.
I'm so glad it worked to have you both on together. I know you've teamed up in many public forums before, so thank you for coming. Well, there's so many things I want to ask, want to make use of the time. I just thought we should set the stage a bit for people who maybe haven't been reading as much. First of all, how big is this problem? I've seen some statistics that the UN has put out, millions and millions, they say are involved as victims.
Yeah.
Do you have a more specific number?
I would say that we're really quite cautious and careful about giving out actual numbers around victims because it's underground, it's illegal activity, it can be very dangerous, and so the numbers are really hard to gather. What we know in Minnesota and what we have said is if anyone is being trafficked, that's one too many. Obviously, we know that the numbers are very great, but we really are very cautious about giving specific numbers.
As I read about this topic, I did think it's kind of like a dirty secret for our culture and our society, isn't it? I mean, people don't talk about it as much as we should, perhaps because of all kinds of reasons, but victims certainly have a lot of fear as part of it.
Yeah,
Do you have
I think
any
that's so
numbers, or?
true because if you think about it, if you're a victim of being prostituted or sex trafficked, people aren't necessarily going to raise their hand and say, this is happening to me. And so for a really long time, because it is in many ways kind of under the radar, here in the state of Minnesota, we thought for a very long time that this problem didn't exist here. But it is a worldwide problem, but Minnesota is no exception. And it's really all about the vulnerability of kids who get trafficked, and oftentimes those traffickers will prey on that vulnerability. So if you've run away from home, so think about all the kids that have run away from home, right? Mm-hmm. Teens that have done that. If you've got emotional health, mental health issues, drug addiction, past sex abuse, or just unstable family life, all of those just contribute. And these traffickers know exactly what to do. And of course, this is all about the demand. We wouldn't have this problem. And so I always say it's really commensurate with your population. So where there are more people and where there's more demand, this problem in terms of people wanting to buy and sell other people for sex is going to exist commensurate with kind of where the population might be. But oftentimes it's not just about population, because if you've got runaways from your community in greater Minnesota, oftentimes those kids might get on a bus and travel here to my community in St. Paul and end up becoming trafficked after a few days. And so that's really the nature of it. Yeah.
But we do see sex trafficking going on in rural Minnesota.
Oh, absolutely.
And in small communities too, correct?
Absolutely, yeah.
In terms of using the term sex trafficking, I've read some varying ways of defining who's sex trafficked. Mm-hmm. Only girls, girls under 18, women and girls, And I think we're talking tonight, aren't we, about women and girls?
Yes, we're talking about women and girls and boys and men.
And boys can be trafficked
Right,
too,
boys
can't they?
absolutely can be trafficked.
Yes,
And we
yes.
see a high incidence, to John's point about vulnerabilities, in the gay, lesbian, bi, transgender communities, high risk.
Now, I had not read about that, that angle. I just wanted to go back to your point about, we used to think Minnesota was kind of immune to this kind of issue, but I've heard that we're actually one of the states that has a higher number of people who are victimized. Does that fit with what
Yeah,
you've
there was
heard?
some FBI data,
right.
and I think it's kind of confusing about the accuracy of it, but I would be willing to bet. I think we're the 15th largest metropolitan area, so I bet you Minnesota is probably commensurate with that. It really goes down to
So pretty
really
proportionate.
proportionate to the demand. I mean, it's estimated that 100,000 kids are trafficked in this country alone. And that's from the Department of Justice, and there's other figures out there. But but since we have done a better job of actually identifying victims and also figuring out who victims are, because we used to arrest and prosecute a 17-year-old who had been prostituted for being engaged in prostitution. Right. And so we've changed all of that, which is really critical. And then we've trained officers and child protection workers and others on the front lines to better identify those situations. And now, with that, the instances of police reports, actual cases against traffickers, cases against the commercial sex buyer, or the John, have dramatically increased in the state of Minnesota because we're just better. It's not necessarily that these incidents are increasing. We're just better at identifying them. We're better as a community to say that this is wrong, and we're going to do things to help the victims and hold accountable the perpetrators, which are both the sellers and the buyers.
And isn't a lot of what you're saying has the improvements that have come about because of the work of you in your office?
But I mean,
as well as
so
the
many other people. I will never,
too.
but just so many people. This is
Right.
so great to see in Minnesota. It's been a bipartisan effort amongst legislators, amongst foundations like the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, other prosecutors, law enforcement, advocacy organizations, service providers. A real strong coalition has come together, first to say that we're not going to criminalize victims who are being prostituted, and we're going to get that right. And secondly, we're going to build an infrastructure around Safe Harbor and actually fund it so that we have services and we have treatment beds. I mean, we started this conversation back in 2011. There were two beds. Today, there's close to 50 beds serving those who have been sexually exploited and or trafficked. So we've come a long way, but it was done together. It was done in a bipartisan way. It was done in a collaborative way. And so it's just great to see Minnesota being kind of a shining star amongst other states.
Now we're kind of a model, aren't
Right.
we,
Yes.
in the way we're handling it and,
Yes.
and becoming more aggressive. I want to just talk for a minute and have you each comment on the Safe Harbor law, because was it 2014 when it actually became a law?
2014 when it actually started to become implemented.
Oh, it became implemented.
Right.
So just would you explain, it's a real paradigm shift, and you mentioned it, but I just think it's worth hitting again because it's such a shocking thing to realize what it was like compared to now in terms of the way we view the victim and the exploiter.
Yeah, so as John said, we were before treating youth, and that's how the Women's Foundation really got involved in the issue, because we had our city attorney, Susan Siegel, call us in to say that they were seeing young girls coming in front of her bench who were being treated as criminals, right? They were being put into the juvenile justice system. And so we really knew that we had to do something to shift the responsibility and to ensure that people who were being trafficked were being treated as victims of a crime rather than being put into the criminal justice system. And so I think we used some of the national safe harbor laws, but we really ramped it up, and our legislative body said, we're going to enact a safe harbor law, but we're going to go one step further and say that by the time that we implement it, we want a plan in place, how we're going to provide services, services, how we're going to provide trauma-informed care, how we're going to provide housing, all of the services, wraparound services, how are we going to train law enforcement so that when they pick a kid up on the street, they're not assuming that they're just a juvenile delinquent, but that there may be some other trauma that's sometimes really hard to get at with kids who've been trafficked.
Yeah, the kids, as you said, are vulnerable. They're in crisis mode kind of constantly, I'm sure. We are taping on November 20th. We're looking forward to the Super Bowl coming. And we've been reading a lot about sex trafficking and major events. And there are some myths and some realities here that I thought it'd be interesting to have you both share.
Sure.
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, so we have always heard, or many of us have read, the alarming statistics that the Super Bowl is the single largest event that attracts traffickers to a community, and the numbers are just going to be off the chart. And so when the Women's Foundation knew that the Super Bowl was coming, and we like to build all of the work that we do on fact and not fiction, so we actually had our researcher come in and really look at some of the work that had been done around past Super Bowls. And what we discovered is that there is an uptick in trafficking during the Super Bowl, just as there is with any major event that comes to a community. If it's a convention, a conference, so anytime you bring a large number of people into a city, you will see an uptick in trafficking.
Can you say what kind of an uptick? I mean, 5%, 10%, 20%?
You know, we don't know that because the other Super Bowl host communities really have looked at the issue very differently than we do in Minnesota. So we're really anxious, and we're going to be tracking, and we're doing grant making to support our service providers. We're looking at law enforcement. We really want to get a solid grasp of the numbers, what happens around the Super Bowl, and how can we use that to inform other major events, other Super Bowl host cities in the future. So we're hoping that as part of our work, we're going to, first of all, disrupt trafficking in the metro area during the Super Bowl, but more importantly, to be able to really quantify the reality of what happens.
So there's carry-on then, isn't there, if we can quantify the reality?
And I think the most important message for the viewers is to know that when the Super Bowl leaves, sex trafficking and the exploitation of vulnerable people and the buying and selling of people for sex is still going to exist in our community. In fact, it happens 365 days a year, every hour, every minute of the day. In fact, if I were to post an ad right now on Backpage.com, I swear to you, within 2 minutes, Mary, the phone would ring, and it would ring and ring and ring all day long. That's how much demand that we have here in the state of Minnesota. For people who want to buy that. And so I think another critical conversation too is just about addressing the demand. And we're doing a lot of work around utilizing the felony child solicitation law. I mean, these are people who are communicating with an undercover police officer, and they're wanting to buy sex from somebody who is younger than age 15. And so that's the demand that exists.
So specifically, they're requesting.
That's what the law. That's what the law
is. The law is set up
says that. So the undercover agent will pose as a trafficker, or maybe a mom who's selling their child, or just a 15-year-old boy, or whatever it might be. But that's the demand that we have here in the state, and so we have to also have conversations about how we raise boys, so we don't do those things.
Yeah, I want to thank you for bringing that up, because we really do need to, as a community, talk more about engaging the male part of our population in helping with this. And,
not as an indictment, but as an invitation, really, for all of us, right? As moms and dads to have these conversations.
Brothers and
sisters
and uncles and
grandpas,
grandpas.
You bet.
And yet, I was thinking from a male point of view, I heard a man recently say, it's so uncomfortable right now in our culture because I think every man feels somewhat guilty about an off-color joke he's told, some stupid thing he's done, and yet we really need to say, now is the time, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the specific ways you are both thinking of bringing men more into this whole issue?
Sure. Well, I think the Women's Foundation is really talking about how do we start to engage men in the issue, and I think we realize that that's the next great frontier for the foundation. So we've done some funding of men's organizations. We funded a group that does a new project that we're launching. In fact, it's already launched leading up to the Super Bowl. It's called the Don't Buy It Project, and it's really targeted at young men, older men, and it talks about the realities of sexual exploitation. There's a pledge that men can take. There's a curriculum that they can use with their church groups or their community groups. So we're really talking about engaging men, bringing men of influence together. So when I say that, I mean men who are in positions that can really shift institutions, can really influence their communities, can influence their corporations. So how do we really start to have those deep dialogues around shifting gender norms?
So
right?
partly you're saying, Terry, just by talking about it in your corporation, in your workplace, in your nonprofit.
Right, and really training those men in terms of what does it mean to do that, sometimes really uncomfortable work, because you know how often men have said, I knew it was wrong, but I stayed silent, right? I didn't say anything.
Right. There was a article in the paper, and I think it was maybe from Time magazine originally, but it talked about, from the woman's point of view, how the writer said, it kind of breaks my heart to think about all the men that I'm close to that have been silent. And, you know, that has made such a major difference in how slow we've come to get on top of this.
Yeah, but I think things are changing for the
But
better.
they're changing, aren't they?
They are. I think we're at a tipping point now where people are starting to realize that, you know, men shouldn't be acting in this particular manner, and if you do, there are certain consequences that follow, and so we've seen a lot of things that have transpired just very, very recently, and it's happening so quickly. But I think all of those are really positive things. I think a lot of the, from a male perspective, you know, the cultural norms that surround men, that contributes to that silence of just, you know, laughing along or minimizing something. And really, I think a world where men are raised to not objectify women as sexual objects, to treat them as human, just like how you would like to be treated. Those are norms that I think are starting to gain traction. Right? Because if you don't, there are going to be consequences for that, social consequences and also potential legal consequences. But that's all a good thing. It's not only good for women and girls, but I really think it's good for men and boys as well.
It seems, as we were talking before the show started, that as I said, this is November when we're taping.
Yeah.
Things are just really, it's an uproar time in our culture, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
In a good way.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, good in that we're starting to uncover things that should have been uncovered.
Yeah.
I feel really hopeful because when we're out talking with groups and when we're doing some of the work we're doing right now, working with high schools and high school students, and it's not just the girls that are getting involved, but the boys, right? And we have some challenges that are going on right now with sports teams challenging, kind of like the Icebox Challenge, but really around sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. And the girls' sports teams have started it, but they're getting boys involved also, and I just feel really encouraged. I think it's just really a sign of where we're starting to move as that next generation can come with us.
I have a little 10-year-old grandson, and we were driving in the car the other day, and there was a song on the radio, and he said, Grandma, what do you think of that song? And I said, well, I like the melody. And he said, but did you hear the words? They're putting down women. And I hadn't even listened to the words. It was kind of a rap type song. And I tuned it out, but I thought, good. That is a sign of progress, isn't it?
Sure, absolutely.
We're talking about boys. When I read about the exploiters and the men who are looking for sex trafficked victims, I read that 14% of men in our country have at one time or another taken part in this. And I also read, and I want to see if you agree with my facts here, that the largest group of men are white and middle class men. And I was thinking, well, that's a kind of a secret in our society, isn't it? Does this fit with what you know?
Sure, I think the information that we have about the demand, it would be really commensurate with our demographics. So anybody could be engaged on that side of the equation, whether you live in the suburbs, you live in the city, different races, but I think it's consistent with demographics of a community.
So 14% doesn't surprise you of men who have been involved in
no,
sex
it doesn't.
trafficking?
Yeah, I mean,
It's
Right.
about what you'd expect?
Right.
How about you, Terry?
Yeah, and I think, the research that we did most recently commissioned was called Mapping the Demand, and it really looked at buyers across the state of Minnesota. And I think one of the shocking things for many people was certainly the demographic was not a shock to anyone, and it wasn't an aha moment, but I think there was a lot of surprise about the number of transactions that happen on the commute to work and the commute home from work.
Yeah.
And I think that people were really pretty stunned by that.
And is that what you've learned is key times that people are
Yes.
or the key time,
Right.
either before or after work?
Right. So what does that tell you about what men are doing and when they're purchasing? And so I think that if we can use the data, and again, we say at the foundation, research without action is pointless. So how do we use that to both educate men and use it with law enforcement, use it with other people that might be interested in some of that data?
The data is fascinating. Well, one way that comes to mind, of course, in terms of affecting demand is punishment.
Yeah.
And what are you learning about sentencing and punishment? And I think in the past it's not been.
It hasn't been, no.
Very
So typically,
hard.
in the past, what was used was the misdemeanor or the gross misdemeanor, which would be engaging in prostitution. And if it were happening at a hotel, that's a gross misdemeanor because it's viewed as a public place. And then just until recently, we've started using the felony child solicitation law to get at more serious consequences. But still, for the most part, the sentences are typically going to be no more than 90 days in jail, if that even. And oftentimes it'll be a probationary sentence with a really hefty fine. But at least, we're treating some of these demand situations as felonies. And then with respect to the cases where there isn't an undercover agent posing as someone under the age of 15, it's the legislature has codified that as a misdemeanor or a gross misdemeanor. So there still isn't a lot of penalty. But I think a lot of studies and surveys would say that people do this because they think they can't get caught too. That's a big part of that equation. Right. So I think just having that law enforcement is having a preventive impact. And then in addition to that, the anonymity, I think now with the internet, it's even maybe become more,
So if they fear that it could become public, that's a deterrent, of course, right?
Yeah, and a lot of these individuals, they've got a lot to lose, and so sometimes you have to, that's what you have over them.
If it's a felony charge as compared to a misdemeanor, does that mean there would be more public awareness via newspaper coverage, or
Our
is there
newspapers are
correlation?
pretty good at covering, but it's usually just the high-profile names. It's that high-profile employee
Right,
at the Department of Commerce or whatever.
Right.
But you also have to think about, too, that a lot of these men, they're married, and they've got families. And so what about the impact to that 16-year-old daughter whose father is on the front page of the paper for being engaged in she's an innocent victim. She didn't do anything wrong.
Right.
But she bears the impact of all of that. Of course, that was caused by her father, but those are things that also, too, we have to be mindful of.
Right.
Yeah, that I would hope that would be a deterrent.
Yeah.
I'm getting the signal that we need to give viewers a way to get more information. So I'm going to at least get one or two more quick questions in, but we'll pause for that. If you would like more information, there's just lots on the Women's Foundation website. John Choi's office has a lot in terms of what's going on in terms of training and law enforcement connections. So we suggest that you Google Minnesota Girls Are Not for Sale. And this is part of the campaign at the foundation. This will get you to all the proper places. And I think you'll find a rich supply of good information. Well, in just the last few minutes, I think people are saying, as they're watching, I hope they're saying, well, is there anything I can do as a citizen, as a person who wants to increase awareness. Is there anything we can do as plain old citizens?
I think there's many things that we can do as citizens. So I would say one thing is that we can look at how do we support communities that have the services and the resources to raise safe, healthy children. How do we keep kids from being vulnerable in the first place?
So kind of look at the long picture, the big broad picture.
Right. If we really want to get at prevention, we've got to go upstream and look at how do we ensure that kids have opportunity, economic opportunity, that they can grow up in safe communities, that the vulnerabilities that exist can be removed. So I think that's one really big thing.
Yeah, and I think also just on the prevention side, it's not an easy thing to talk about. But we should be talking more about sex, right? And what is healthy sex? What is in the context of a relationship? There's so much stuff on the internet, pornography, all of that. And so I think just having the healthy viewpoints and attitudes about sex is really critical. And then, of course, that whole conversation about boys and men and how boys should be growing into manhood, looking at women and how not to objectify, et cetera. Those types of values I think are so critical if we really want to end this, because we'll do a really good job in this state of responding, because now that we know this is a problem, we're going to prosecute better, we're going to arrest, but we're not going to solve it that way. We're going to throw more money at the issue, but that's still not going to solve it unless we start having some really important conversations within our families and our communities about that, how boys should grow up to be men.
So talking about it at the dinner table, talking about it over the holidays,
yes.
talking about it when you're watching some of these major sports events, right?
Yeah, and there's a lot of organizations out there like the Women's Foundation and others that are doing great work in this area, and to support them.
Well, thank you both so much for coming
Mary.
down.
Thanks so much, Delighted.
This has been
really
a
fun.
real learning kind of a show for me, and I'm sure for a lot of viewers too.
Yeah.
Thank you both. We've been talking about sex trafficking in Minnesota. Thanks for being with us. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.